Okay, thanks to everybody for coming. I am very happy to introduce Jenn Henrichsen. Jenn is an assistant professor, as you can see there, at the Murrow College of Communication at Washington State. And we're very pleased that she's made her way over to the West Side today to be able to talk to us about some of her research. Jenn studies various aspects of journalism, oftentimes in its relationship to technology, and confronts what I think are very basic questions that many people, whether you're interested in journalism or communication more generally, are really concerned about today's democratic backsliding, economic challenges, career prospects for people who want to pursue careers in journalism. Jenn is, amongst other things, a fellow for Carnegie this year, which is really quite the honor and a considerable accomplishment. And today she is going to be talking to us about mapping precarity, designing resilience, a conceptual framework for securing journalism amid authoritarian drift. So please join me in welcoming Jenn.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. I know it's a time and a quarter, and I appreciate you being here. I'm Jennifer Henrichsen, and I'm a journalism studies scholar within the field of communication. And as Matt mentioned, I'm going to be talking about mapping precarity and designing resilience, a conceptual framework for securing journalism amid authoritarian drift. And I will say authoritarian drift is sort of a nice term, so I don't know if that necessarily still will apply in a few years. Most of us are probably familiar with the fact that across the globe, democracies are declining as authoritarian regimes and hybrid regimes are accelerating. This map comes from the Economic Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index, and it shows that the majority of the world countries are increasingly authoritarian. And you'll see too that the United States right there is now light blue rather than dark blue, which indicates it's a flawed democracy, which is something that we got demoted in 2016 following that election. Now, journalism tends to serve as an early warning system for democratic life. This image comes from the Varieties of Democracy Research Project, which is also known as VDEM, which you might be familiar with. And it shows the top 20 indicators that declined in the largest number of countries over the last decade. 9 out of the top 20 indicators relate to the freedom of expression component of democracy. And if you drill down a little further, you can see that some of these indicators actually relate specifically to journalistic risk. So you can see media self-censorship, you can see harassment of journalists, and you can also see government censorship efforts of the media. Now, my research broadly examines dimensions of journalistic risk, including the risks that journalists face, both external risks such as physical abuse or online harassment, as well as internal threats such as sexual harassment in newsrooms. Also, the repercussions that this abuse has on journalists and journalism. So we can think about the journalistic autonomy, we can think about journalist-audience relationships, those types of repercussions, and finally the societal or institutional structures that determine the conditions for journalistic work, and which link both the individual journalist to larger societal structures. Nestled within the concept of journalistic risk is journalistic precarity, which Siebert defines as the uneven distribution of objective and subjective news work. When we think about objective insecurity, we can think of material conditions, such as diminished news organizations, right, from an economic standpoint, for example, or precarious employment. When we think of subjective insecurity, we can think about individual feelings or processes of meaning making. Now, journalistic precarity affects news routines and also the occupational identity of journalists, and thus has real repercussions for both the occupation of journalism as well as the information environment that we're all in. Now, according to Siebert, there are 4 main forces that affect journalistic precarity. We have the industrial up here, technological, cultural, and political. And just really briefly, when I'm talking about industrial, I mean the structures of the news enterprise under capitalism. When we think about the technological, those are like operational facets of news work. So think about how technology has challenged journalism in terms of dissemination, consumption, right, and even production of the news. Cultural, the meanings that social groups derive from their historical conditions, which illuminates the discourses and trends, right, over specific periods of time. And then political, which we're all very familiar with, right, rising political polarization, rising authoritarianism, democratic backsliding, all of these lovely forces. So these four forces are intertwined to some degree. They're not disparate. And they shape the current environment that's facing journalism. I'm going to focus only on one, and that's the technological aspect. And specifically within that, I'm going to be talking about the cyber-physical precarity of journalists. And I call it that because it involves both online harassment and the various aspects of online life, and it involves physical abuse or physical assault, every day sort of embeddedness. So unfortunately, a cyber-physical precarity of journalists is intensifying. And so today, my plan is to talk a little bit about a larger book project, which examines why both journalists and news organizations are reluctant to adopt protective technologies, despite this increasing cyber-physical precarity, and what we can do about it. And I find, just as a preview, competing institutional logics that really reward maintaining the status quo, while simultaneously signaling security to enhance external legitimacy to various audiences. So this is a paradox of stasis and change, and it has important implications both for journalism and other knowledge professions, as well as governance, right? Because journalism has long held a normative role in holding powerful interests and actors to account. And so in my book, I attempt to chart a way forward through this impasse through a discursive process known as securitization, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But before I get to that, I want to paint a picture of the cyber-physical precarity that's facing journalists. At the most basic level, journalists around the world are being killed for their work. In one of my first books, titled War on Words, Who Should Protect Journalists, my co-author and I found that local journalists were more likely to be targeted than foreign correspondents. And that's partly because they can't leave when the situation deteriorates, right? They're stuck there, their families are there. So there's an embeddedness to them being there. Additionally, the murders of journalists tend to go unpunished. So you have really rampant impunity and you have little accountability, right? So you don't have much deterrence. And suffice it to say, right, security and safety strategies are insufficient. Unless we think this is not the case anymore, unfortunately, as CPJ has shown us, almost 2,000 journalists have been killed since they started documenting this in 1992 to present day. And this is actually a low number because I only include journalists, I don't include media workers, and I only include motive confirmed, not motive unconfirmed. So this doubles if I expand it. Additionally, and unfortunately, the most journalists killed in any particular conflict is actually happening right now, with 248 journalists, according to the UN, having been killed in the Israel-Gaza war since it started in October of 2023. Now, journalists also face the cyber dimension, right, of cyber-physical precarity. And in this report for UNESCO, my co-authors and I mapped the digital safety threats and challenges that are facing journalists globally. And we found a lot of them. We found disinformation campaigns, denial of service attacks, hardware and software exploits, right? Hacking, for example, phishing attempts, online harassment, which tends to be gendered, and surveillance, both targeted and mass surveillance. These safety threats are intensifying as technologies become more ubiquitous and more networked. And previously, journalists appeared more at risk by nation-state actors and para-state actors who are working on behalf of the government, but now we have the everyday citizen deciding to target journalists, such as what Sylvia Weisborn, who's a very influential journalism studies scholar, terms mob censorship, which is essentially citizen vigilantism aimed at disciplining and silencing journalists. It's not only nation states and para-state actors and mobs, however, targeting journalists. You can also see that in press coverage, and normal news gathering practices about journalist killings, these can contribute to inadvertent complicity with systemic violence. So the coverage itself can actually re-victimize journalists through denials and dehumanization, which in turn can constitute discursive violence, which is basically discourse that causes further harm. And if we think about the second category of journalistic risk from the beginning, right? So the types of threats that journalists face and the repercussions of this abuse, there are many. So we have mental health crises, we have self-censorship on the part of journalists, we have journalists leaving the field because they just can't take it anymore, implications for journalistic autonomy and the decrease of that, as well as changing natures of the journalist and audience relationship, and freedom of expression and democratic function more generally. I also want to briefly talk about the third dimension of journalistic risk, which is about the societal and institutional structures on journalism practice and roles. In this report for UNESCO, this covered Western Europe and North America, no easy feat. And I found societal structures playing a role, right? There's a heightened climate of populism and nationalism. Specific governments were trying to monitor so-called fake news, which was basically critical media coverage, which in turn can impede media independence. At the same time, you have media concentration and convergence and capture, which indicates risks both to media pluralism as well as media independence and media freedom. At the same time, you also have political turmoil and violent groups and verbal attacks, which in turn can decrease journalism safety. Now, there are particular historical events, like the Snowden revelations, that have also underscored how the political and institutional, as well as the physical infrastructure of surveillance can impact journalism practice. So, for example, state surveillance can increase the technical challenges of carrying out journalism safely and securely. At the same time, mass surveillance and governmental actors' use of the Espionage Act to chill free speech can occur, which can curtail the constitutional equal rights of a free press. Meanwhile, we have intensifying and ubiquitous surveillance technologies. We are operating in an environment of strategic disinformation and what some call information warfare. At the same time, you also have an influx in both individuals communicating information that are not historically journalists, right? So disseminators of information, but also just so much information in this environment. So it's easy for it to be weaponized. These societal and institutional dynamics are concurrently contributing to something called digital repression, which Feldstein says is the use of information and communications technology to surveil, coerce, or manipulate individuals or groups in order to deter specific activities or beliefs that challenge the state. Unless we think we aren't at risk of digital repression, this is actually increasingly happening transnationally. So you're not even safe if you cross over into a different country. It transcends nation-state borders. And yet, we are reliant on digital technologies that generate data and metadata about ourselves, our networks, our locations, and our habits, which of course implicates key tenets of journalistic practice, such as communicating with sources to obtain information, to hold powerful interests and actors to account. And we know that journalists, as collectors, curators, and disseminators of information, are at heightened risk for increased observation by powerful entities. But despite that, protective strategies remain nascent or non-existent. So several years ago, in my capacity as a research fellow at Columbia University, I worked with the Pew Research Center to create a survey focused on U.S. investigative journalists and digital security. And we found that 80% of investigative journalists in the U.S. who were surveyed believe that actually just being a journalist may increase the likelihood of the U.S. government collecting their data. Yet, 50% indicated they do not use any digital security tools to protect their information. In addition, the majority of journalists had not received any formal training or instruction about digital security, and only 27% of journalists surveyed had spent some time in the past 12 months researching how to improve it. That was about a decade ago when that survey came out. Unfortunately, things still look bad. So this survey occurred in 2024 by Internews. They surveyed 122 journalists across Central and Southeastern Europe, and they found that 74% of surveyed journalists believe that they could face risks to their digital safety because of their work. Yet, more than half of the journalists surveyed said they have insufficient knowledge, right, about digital security. I was also interested in this at the local level, and I'll be talking more about the local news aspects tomorrow in the mixer. But I wanted to know to what extent local news organizations were facing safety and security challenges. And so in the survey, I put in a question about safety and security challenges, right? How many, or did journalists at their organization experience safety or security challenges within the last 5 years? And 66% said yes, right? Most common was online harassment. That's probably not that surprising, right? What was surprising was disinformation campaigns, because historically disinformation campaigns are from nation-state actors and in very specific authoritarian regimes. But these, and I'm conducting the interviews right now with the survey participants, but so far it's disgruntled sources. Politicians were mad about coverage. Really interesting at the local level what's happening, okay? And then of course physical, intimidation or abuse and hacking. So what these surveys and these preliminary findings show is that although journalists may feel that carrying out their work may make them more vulnerable to information security concerns, it actually hasn't led to significant behavior changes around protective digital technologies. And I wanted to understand that paradox. So I decided to investigate it further with this book that's under review. And in the book, I wrestle with key questions, right? Specifically, I ask, why are journalists and news organizations reluctant to engage in protective technologies, even as attacks against journalists increase? And amidst this rising cyber-physical precarity, how can information security be integrated into journalism effectively? As an academic, we always define our terms, right? So by information security, I mean the protection of information and information systems from unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, or destruction in order to provide confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But information security is not just an individual problem, even though it's been conceptualized as such, which I will talk about in a minute. I also want to understand how information security can sort of be embedded at the meso level of news organizations. So for that, I was interested in understanding information security cultures, which are shared patterns of values, mental models, and activities that are traded among an organization's employees over time, affecting information security. So to answer the questions that I put on the slide just a couple of slides ago, I used the theoretical frame of new institutionalism. And I used that because it's very helpful to understand the paradox of stasis and change. And because its sociological view of institutions illuminates how they interact, how they can influence human behavior, and how they aim to both gain legitimacy and to survive within a world of other institutions. Now, within new institutionalism, there are a lot of concepts that are very relevant to this research. I'm going to go through a few of them. The first one is the concept of institutional isomorphism, which is essentially when institutional fields mirror dominant practices and forms to avoid claims of negligence and to gain public legitimacy. Institutional isomorphism occurs through three mechanisms of change. And these include coercive, mimetic, and normative pressures. When we think about coercive, we can think about regulatory pressures, we can think about laws, formal rules of governance. When we think about mimetic pressures, this is usually visible when organizations engage in activities and behaviors to imitate those peers because they're successful. And normative isomorphism is when organizational change primarily occurs through professionalization, such as on-the-job training or formal journalism education. Also within new institutionalism, there's this concept of an institutional entrepreneur who is an individual capable of sparking institutional change because they're creative And they have social positions and skills that allow them to recognize problems or opportunities and take advantage to change the social order. And finally, decoupling. And this is when organizations seek to achieve institutional legitimacy by engaging in superficial change while still continuing core activities. Interestingly, little academic attention has actually put these two together. So the concepts of institutional isomorphism and decoupling. And so I'll talk about that in this as well. So to carry out this work, I interviewed 79 journalists, editors, technologists, journalism professors and students, media lawyers, and a couple of people from nonprofits and academics who are focused in on this space. I've talked to 45 men, 34 women who identified as white, black, or Latinx, and in general, the interviews lasted on average 46 minutes, and I used a snowball sample. And I used the snowball sample because I'm asking really sensitive questions around information security. So you really need to have this sort of climate of trust in order to get anything out of people. And my interviewees came from a wide range of organizations. So digital, first organizations, investigative, more mainstream national news organizations, local news organizations, etc. So what I found were three main buckets of obstacles. Okay? These included occupational disinterest, mental models, and commercial logics. So within this first category of occupational disinterest, I found that people are perceiving security as an individual and not a collective responsibility, which brings me back to what I was talking about earlier, right? I don't want to only focus on information security, I want to also understand the sort of cultural element of it within a news organization. So one information security trainer said, people are not necessarily always plugged into this idea of security being everyone's job, nor have they internalized the notion that everyone with access to digital or physical assets has a shared responsibility. So journalists may assume that they don't need to know about security because they specifically are not working on something sensitive that they think determines that need, right? But they are operating in an environment in which it's networked. So other people in the arena might be, at risk. And actually, just to give you a brief example of something that came up today, there is a Japanese media company that was hacked through, and malware was disseminated, and the hacker got access to like 17,000 Slack emails and email addresses and conversations from who knows how long, right? So this is an ongoing issue. Relatedly, journalists and management, ones that I interviewed, have a reactive orientation to security concerns. And a trainer talked about how this is something they see all the time in news organizations. So it's a recurring pattern. That something bad has to happen, and then people come together to say, oh, how do we prevent that from happening again? So not proactive at all, very reactive. But this, of course, has implications for how journalists carry out their jobs. So a journalist I talked to at a local news organization, she had been harassed for a long time following the publication of an investigative database. And she wondered at what point management would come up with a plan to help her out. She said, something really bad needs to happen for people to take it seriously. And she blames management on this front. She says her direct supervisor is fine, but in general, the sort of the culture is that, we'll deal with it once something really bad happens. What is really bad? I don't know, right? Something probably relating to physical abuse of some sort as a result of the online harassment. The second category of obstacles involves mental models, right? So the ways in which people conceptualize information. And what I found was that journalists tend to hold a perception that they don't need to be concerned about information security unless they were reporting on something obviously sensitive to the government. Although, think about how swiftly governments change, right? What might be sensitive now was not sensitive in the last administration. According to one media lawyer, the vast majority feels like nobody's out to get them, they're not doing anything that's important, nobody's going to try to steal their stuff. Even the ones that are doing sensitive stuff feel like they're generally protected. And this belief system relates to what McGregor and Watkins have called a security by obscurity mental model, in which journalists feel like they have nothing to worry about, as long as they don't report on topics that might concern the government's massive surveillance apparatus, which to me suggests internal self-censorship, right? You might not choose to report on something. Alongside this mental model is a mental model that I call the security but insulated mental model, in which journalists believe they're insulated from risk because they're working in a democratic environment that historically has been fairly good for journalists. And there are certain protections that come with that. And because they personally haven't experienced a concern, a digital attack, for example. One journalist said, security is a really easy thing to overlook, especially if you haven't had a breach, if you haven't been intimately involved in wide-scale harassment or doxing or swatting or being hacked. People think the stakes are really low, and they're just wrong. And I want to also get to the third category of obstacle, which relates to commercial logics. So I found that competing institutional logics can hinder security adoption. One media lawyer said, you want ease of use, that makes sense, but you also want security, and those things can work against each other. Sometimes you're going to compromise on one or the other. Well, journalists are in a time-sensitive environment. They have deadlines. They have to get the story fast, it has to be accurate, they have to verify it, and they have to get it published, right? So, ease of use, if it's going to be in contrast with security, ease of use will win out. Additionally, journalists also need to balance their reporting practices and news gathering practices with not scaring their sources away, right? So using security tools for news gathering without scaring their sources. An information security technologist said you have to walk this line between having them use something that's maybe digitally safe or encrypted or whatever without scaring them off or freaking them out. Okay. And again, if your source is only going to communicate with you in an unencrypted fashion, what are you going to do? You're probably going to just talk to them in an unencrypted fashion, right? Because you need that information. Additionally, as it relates to commercial logics, frictions between departments can limit security integration. Okay? So conflicts between IT and journalism are at play. So sometimes IT might block actually virtual private networks or Tor within the newsroom if that journalist happens to be working with an external security trainer who says, hey, you should probably use this for your sensitive work. And that can contribute to a shadow IT culture where reporters create their own tech setups and their own lines of communication that are outside the domain of IT. And I get it to an extent, but at the same time, security is thus outsourced. It doesn't fit with the normal routines and tasks of doing journalism, and it suggests that security is secondary to these normal undertakings of news gathering. And this also aligns with how innovations in journalism have historically occurred, with new technologies related to journalism or to even types of journalists being viewed by journalists, at least initially, as things were outside the domain of what journalism is and what journalism does. The problem with this is, if security is perceived as external to a news organization, you're going to have a very risky environment facing your journalists in your news organization. At the same time, I noticed something pretty interesting in these interviews. When I listened to journalists talk about journalism, they brought up particular news flashpoints, which Weisbord and Russell have defined as sudden and brief periods when interest in specific topics rises and falls rapidly across network journalism. And these news flashpoints made security more salient in their minds. These primarily were the Snowden revelations, the DNC hacks, and Trump's 2016 election. And as such, these became sites of meta-journalistic discourse and served, in many ways, as critical incidents, which Zelizer describes as events that force members of the journalism community to reflect on collective practices, to negotiate boundaries, and to protect its strengths. So the discourse then provides clues and cues for what journalists are thinking and how they are thinking about journalism, which in turn can consolidate them as an interpretive community and provide opportunities for enhanced autonomy as well as enhanced legitimacy. And I argue that these discussions can actually provide opportunities out of this impasse of intransigence as it relates to security. In other words, the discourse reveals that change is possible. And I found evidence of this through those isomorphic pressures I mentioned at the beginning. pressures were occurring at those three levels, the coercive, the mimetic, and the normative. And just to give an example of each, I found that although coercive isomorphism is typically understood as sort of like regulatory pressure or laws, like formal laws, it actually showed up in sources. So journalists were more willing to engage with encrypted technologies, especially following the Snowden revelations, if they thought it would get them more sources. So as one journalist put it, he wanted to put his encrypted handle on his social media feeds because he looked at it as a bat signal. He said, this is the way that people will come to me to know that I take security seriously and can be trusted. So this requires journalists to change their behavior, right? If they think that they must in order to get sources information. So in that way it's coercive. Now, mimetic isomorphism was also visible. And this was visible following Trump's 2016 election through the adoption of Secure Drop, which is an anonymous whistleblowing submission platform. So it first was introduced in 2015. Almost nobody adopted it, right? However, Trump gets elected in 2016. Loads of news organizations suddenly are very interested and talk to the Freedom of the Press Foundation, who puts this into people's news organizations, and they want it in their news organization. So that's showing you this news flashpoint and also this isomorphic pressure of mimicry, essentially. Something that's going for Secure Drop is that it's a one-time investment. So a journalist talked about it as installing a ramp at the entrance of your newsroom. Once it's there, and you don't have to spend too much money on it, right? Because sort of underlying all of these discussions, which you may hear, is this focus on economic pressures, right? Lack of money, lack of resources, lack of time. Now, implementing Secure Drop also serves, kind of like putting your handle on Twitter, well, X now, it serves as a signal, right, that you're legitimate, that you take security seriously. But what was also interesting is that the news organizations didn't have information security policies. So you have this implementation of something like Secure Drop, but the rest of the news organization is sort of operating the status quo. What I found was there is many individuals, but they're all sort of understood as these security champions, these institutional entrepreneurs, basically individuals who care about security, who want to teach others in their news organization about security, and thus champion it. So security champion came directly from the interviews. And they're not where you necessarily would assume them to be, right? Like investigative only or national security. It's really across the newsroom, which is interesting. And they're helpful to resolving journalism's resistance through normative isomorphism because they're providing this peer-to-peer training. Security champions talk about security in brown bag lunches. They bring it up. They say, hey, editor, I want to talk about this, super important, let's do it. And because it's free other than time, it can happen, right? One problem with the security champion is that they're not necessarily security experts. I mean, they're interested, but do they really know all the ins and outs and possibilities? Not necessarily. But before I get to that, they are helpful in order for external security trainers to say, hey, who are invited into a news organization, for example, hey, we really want a culture of security. So if they can identify a couple people who also care about security, then those people can talk to others in the team and get people on board. That said, they're not experts, right? IT, as one information security technologist says, IT and data journalists are not experts, but in your average news organization, they're the closest thing. That's what people believe, but it's not the right shape to go through that hole. It's not correct mapping, but it's the best that they have. So what this reveals is a very uneven, patchworked approach to the development of security cultures in newsrooms, which is emblematic of journalism's intransigence. Because it reveals how, despite increasing and intensifying threats, there's still this resistance to engaging in practices around information security. Yet, as I I mentioned in the beginning, and as I'm going to mention again, this is important for all of us, right? Because journalism is construed as a pillar of democratic governance. We know democracies are declining. Jack Balkin at Yale talks about constitutional rot. He's a lot of great books, recommend it, if you're willing to be sort of stressed. And at the same time, press protection tends to weaken, right? Trust in democracies and trust in institutions like journalism tend to decrease, although local journalism is more trusted than mass media. And this reduced trust does contribute to a more hostile environment facing the press. And as mentioned earlier, that has consequences, right? For journalism's role in democracy. Journalists may withdraw from different platforms, social media platforms, for example, and say, we're done. This is just too much harassment, I can't handle it. I don't want to see all these threats against me and my family. But in turn, that can reduce one's digital publicity, right? Which can maybe result in lack of sources coming forward or lack of dissemination of information, publishing of stories, etc. So it can affect sources may not come forward to journalists, and as a result, censorship can occur. So what I'm proposing to move us out of this impasse is this concept of securitization. Now, I adapt this from Weber, and I argue that it reflects these three aspects of adaptation pertaining to information security in journalism. So you have the obstacles I mentioned before, you have these motivating factors that can help get us out and resolve this intransigence to information security. So again, just to recap, the obstacles include occupational disinterest in security, mental models, which relate actually to occupational disinterest, and commercial logics, which impede the understanding of information security and its relevance to journalism. At the same time, we have these motivating factors, this professional push for autonomy and legitimacy, right? The consolidation of journalists as an interpretive community, and the gains that arise from discussions of these news flashpoints and these critical incidents. Resolution of the impasse can occur when the factors motivating journalists to adopt information security technologies outweighs the obstacles. And this resolution involves the activation of these specific isomorphic pressures, these mimetic, these coercive, these normative pressures, right? Including the advent of that so-called security champion, who can change thinking and action around information security. Information security is an umbrella condition for the numerous risks that I mentioned at the start afflicting journalism and other knowledge professions today. And it really does encourage a broader debate about the various frictions affecting journalism, both as an institution and also as journalists as individuals, in an increasingly volatile and problematic environment. So by employing this concept of securitization, I'm trying to show how obstacles and motivations are forming the nodes by which journalists both resist but also repudiate this intransigence. And because journalism's reluctance to change the status quo does parallel a fragility facing democratic institutions, it could be, possibly, that solving the indifference to information security can act then as an exemplar for journalism's adaptation to change more broadly, a challenge made urgent by the current threats to democracy. With that, I will end, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thanks, Jen. Questions?
I'm curious, in your 2024 survey of Washington local news outlets, how did you go about recruiting, and how to choose who to speak to on behalf of the entire organization?
Yes, great question. So the 2024 survey is part of a bigger picture project, which is surveying and mapping the local news ecosystem of Washington State. And so it involved a survey to get at a lot of information that was super hard to get, like staffing, circulation, don't get me started on circulation numbers, and other things like that. And then I put in the safety and security question. I wanted to make sure that I got somebody who could answer all the questions in the survey, ideally, right? So I targeted top leadership, CEOs, publishers, general managers, and we got a really good response rate. I mean, part of that was we called them too, and very annoying. But we got a really good response rate. Now, I also in the survey asked if people would be willing for follow-up interviews, and almost everybody agreed to that, which is kind of amazing. I don't know if the Murrow News Fellowship has something to do with this or not, but I will take it. And I followed up with the individuals, starting with the folks who indicated that they do have concerns in their news organization. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah.
I've got just the questions that you're talking about. So the general issue of security, I had actually sort of a particular question, because obviously as you're talking about security relates in many ways to how academics would talk about security,
Yes.
obviously different input. Like when you would talk to a security champion, what's the one thing that you found again and again that the security champion was like, if I could just get the newsroom to do this, things would be much better? Was there one common thing that they were pushing for, one basic security practice across these various institutions?
It was a couple things. One was it was an orientation that security matters to them. So it was trying to make sure that they understood that, look, this actually does have implications for your work. And then the second piece of it was it doesn't have to be expensive, and it doesn't have to be time intensive, because those are blockages, right? Which makes sense considering the economic straits that news organizations find themselves in, and the fact that, I've interviewed people at news organizations. There's one editor who's also the reporter, who's also the publisher. I mean, it's incredible. Like, they have a lot on their plate, right? So what folks said was, just don't reuse passwords, right? Have unique passwords, use a password manager, and enable two-factor authentication. Those were like the very minimum. Now, I will say that organizations seem to be moving toward some of that. Although, the Louvre heist, it happened with Louvre, right? So I don't know. This is a big issue, right, facing a lot of different types of organizations. But those are essentially free. Yeah. Or open source passwords. Yeah. Yes.
I imagine that there were some outlets or journalists where the indifference was less.
Yes.
Security indifference. And what were the conditions you think that led to that? This
Yes.
is actually kind of good.
Yes.
What were the conditions?
Yeah, because I did talk to outlets that were able to do this, right? So I talked to the New York Times, Washington Post, ProPublica, better resources, right? More people working there. Teams, they have legal teams, they have physical safety security teams, they have information security teams. Very rare, it's mainly, to my knowledge, New York Times, Washington Post that do that. ProPublica, you just have a lot of people really good at technology anyway, so they all sort of are acting as like security champions, but also what they work on, right? So the New York Times knows that it's a target for Chinese hackers. It has been, it continues to be, right? So there's more, it's just understood that this could be an issue. That said, you still have to convince individual journalists to engage in it, but they have a director of information security who would make a boutique solution. You're going to China, this is what you need to do. You're going to this place, this is what you need to do. So that's part of it, right? So I'm increasingly more concerned about organizations that don't have those resources, like many of the ones that I talked to, but I also did talk to some of them.
There's no trickle down effect.
Well, there is a little bit, because it's a secure drop, right? So that's a form of mimetic isomorphism. So organizations said, oh, wait, what did you just install? This is gonna get you sources, this is gonna get you stories. Maybe we'll do that. So in that way, that was, but it also is pretty low cost, minimal upkeep, right? And the value proposition is obvious. I mean, I don't know if, everything that they get is not obviously valuable. And there's actually people who provide information that's
Simple.
wrong and malicious, and things like that. But I do think that if you can get more outside organizations assisting news organizations with this sort of thing, then there will be a burgeoning effect. So the Freedom of the Press Foundation is like one of the only organizations in the U.S. that provides digital safety and security training, and they do it on a sliding scale. And it's kind of the news flashpoints. Trump was elected 2016, interest, skyrockets. I'm selected again. They're so busy, I'm working with a principal researcher there, and he's like, I have no time to do this research, because everyone needs them, basically. So yes, interest is increasing. Yeah.
Question. I'm not a journalist, I'm not very familiar with the profession, but could you comment a little bit more on the actual effectiveness of adopting these information security technology? Because I find that's kind of assumption here, but when I'm trying to imagine how effective adopting those would be, it's a little bit hard to see it, particularly in terms of like online harassment. How would using two-step verification, like the tools you mentioned, reduce that?
Well, yes, great question. So it depends on what your concern is. So you brought up online harassment and two-factor authentication. When just to give an example, personal example, I wrote a piece for Pointer in 2015 about online harassment. And fortunately, I took all the steps that I proposed to fellow journalists, like this is what you should do in case you're worried about online harassment. People targeted me for writing that, because I talked about gamer in it. Anyway, so somebody was trying to hack my Twitter that I had two-factor authentication on, and I had a phone number that's not associated with my real phone number, so they couldn't get around it. So effectiveness is very strong. It just depends on what your risks are, and it depends on what you're most worried about. So let's see, to give another example, I mentioned the company that I just read about today that was hacked. So basically what happened there was an employee of the company got malware, and the malware then was able to steal credentials to the Slack channel, and that actually implicates, like I said, like 17,000 email addresses and messages. And who knows what will come out of that, right? Like especially if you don't have a really good data, not retention, but like when you get rid of data, right? Sort of policy. So effectiveness is fairly strong. It just depends again on what you're trying to protect against. And I think one obstacle that I've noticed is that people assume it has to be expensive. Another thing with effectiveness and harassment, some news organizations are now offering services, like paying for services like Delete Me, which is essentially it's an organization that reduces the amount of personal information about you online. And so it prevents, let's say you're worried about online harassment. Well, now you probably won't be doxxed because this organization has removed your address, your phone number, all these other sort of sensitive information. And so there have been instances where news organizations will pay for that service for their employees to make sure that they don't experience worse outcomes.
And ask just a quick follow-up. So since you're talking about the mental model, so when you were interviewing with journalists and also related stakeholders, do you think they have this mental model that this effectiveness is there? Would you think that's actually a problem? Because I think you somehow imply that they don't have the right mental model for them reviewing the effectiveness. Would that be a problem?
I think there's a lack of, there's a concern that they don't know how to do it, right? So that's a piece of it. But that's why these external actors and ideally internal actors who care about security and who teach security can show, hey, this is actually how you change this setting, or this is how you put your laptop in lockdown mode, or your phone in lockdown mode if you're worried about HTC actors targeting, for example. So, perhaps it's more, so far it's been like, we don't think it applies, but as we're seeing intensifying threats, I think that is going to reduce because you're seeing all these attacks against academics, journalists, politicians, right? The environment is worsening, so I do think more people will start to pay attention. Yeah.
So I had a different angle on that, or coming at the same question. So for me, I was thinking about it in terms of so in the new institutionalist, isomorphism is often literally described as a myth, right? The idea is that we should think about organizational routines as less about what they're functionally, their function, and more about their sort of relational sort of thing. I adopted this organizational form with these sets of routines because other people were doing it, not because they were necessarily better for me. And then in fact, in many cases, it's either just not a thing which is sort of discussed, right? And so for me, the question of are these things sort of good practices, or is that an assumption that you're making that these are sort of useful practices, is important because I think that your story about adoption of these like security practices has mostly been like a pretty like, I mean, it's like, it's positive if they adopt them, and it's like not as positive if they don't, right? But I think that, yeah, so I mean, I guess do you see examples of sort of like isomorphic pressure that cause people to adopt things that were not effective, right, security practices, or to not adopt security practices because the best practices within our space are to not do that particular, like, to adopt that thing, right? Because it seems like or it's something that like, Bushnire talks a lot about like as a security professional, perhaps you run into like, he talks a lot about like security theater, for example, right? Like we're doing this because it makes it look like we're secure, but actually it's not sort of necessary. And I think that like my experience with like sort of security professionals has been that they mostly are, the first thing they do is they sit down and you basically say, let's like talk about your threat models, right? Like, is that actually the description of how you're going to do this is really focused on actually like the idea that the appropriate thing for a local, the security system for a local journalism is actually extremely different potentially than the appropriate thing for a person who's doing something else, right? And then as you were suggesting, these things will change in various ways, right? Which actually suggests that isomorphic pressure might be causing people to adopt things that are not the things that they need, right? They're sort of out of alignment. So yeah, I mean, this seemed like a very mostly like a story of like kind of either positive change or in the absence of positive change through a lack of adoption. But did you see examples of adoption that was like less positive, that was sort of, or at least just more like, decoupled from I guess, from the actual organizational needs?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, with Secure Drop, what we saw was an adoption that was happening through mimicry because news organizations assumed that, oh, they're onto something, right? So you had top-tier news organizations do it, and then you had other sort of mid-level organizations also do it. And in that regard, it was still positive, but it didn't necessarily translate to other actions internally. So in that way, it's negative, I would argue, because it sort of presents security theater, right? Like, we're secure, we are doing this new technique, you can trust us. But like internally, have there been any changes? For the most part, from what I can tell from the interviews, we're not. In terms of the risk assessment, yeah, I mean, that is something that the security trainers will also bring up in every conversation. And when I talked about this a long time ago too, like an investigative reporters and editors conference, I was trying to like talk about the importance of the risk assessment, and all the questions that I got were, but what tool can we use now, right? So it was very much like, we don't care about this like abstract risk assessment. I just want to know what can I download, and so I can go about my day and like get the sources information and publish my story. So that's a very real condition. I think still that what I'm seeing is that it's not so much that people are adopting technologies and they didn't need to adopt them, they're just still not adopting them. And that's problematic for all the reasons I laid out at the beginning, right? Increase in online harassment, doxing, swatting, I didn't talk about that, but it's related, as well as hacking and other sorts of problems. Yeah.
I have a kind of a methodological question
Yes.
that's maybe sort of linked to this, which is, so it seems like a lot of the people that you talk with, because of the nature of what you're getting at, are people who kind of believe in the adoption of this.
Yes.
And so therefore, what you have is a very interesting story of their theory of why other people don't do it. And what sounds interesting to me is like, you've got kind of an insight into this community which has their theories of people, but it's not like, I don't think it necessarily totally fits on the prior two comments, but like couldn't there be an interesting theory or sort of an interesting account of how it is that there's this sort of sub-community of people who fashion themselves as solutions to this problem, and they seem to be more or less marginally ineffective in terms of actually being able to impose the vision of what it should be. And so rather than it be a story of why is it that journalists writ large don't do this, because there the answers are kind of, they make a lot of sense, and people are like, I don't know, I don't have time, like
Yeah.
all of that like intuitively seems to make a lot of sense to me. But then if it's focused more on the security professionals, then I wonder if there's kind of a story of both the opportunities that they provide, but also the limits of this particular form of expertise. With news organizations as one example, but I imagine, for instance, like researchers, like university researchers, like I assume in many places at UW, there's people who are extremely frustrated with like 90% of the researcher population in terms of their, like I assume, in terms of their security practices and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then the interesting question is,
I'm
why are
sitting
they not?
behind
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah, so, but then the question is, why is Mako not more successful in
Yeah.
imposing his vision of security
Yeah.
practices on the rest of us?
I don't know, can you help me?
I don't mean Mako.
Yeah.
I know.
I mean, like talking to my students, we're all sending encrypted messages to each other, but, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just a little bit to that, great question. Because it was a snowball sample, I did get people who had some connection to information security. And when I tried to get people who didn't care about security, I had some difficulty there. Because I actually had people respond to me and say, I don't think I'm who you're looking for. I don't do that. And I'm like, no, I do want to talk to you because you don't do that.
But that's interesting, because it's hard to get someone to talk about things they don't do.
Yeah.
Well, exactly, which is why I have so many like hybrid people, right? So if you saw in the interviews, a journalist who now is also this informal security champion, or this journalist who's also like an information security technologist, like rare, but those are the people that didn't want to share. In terms of like why they're not successful, I mean, I think it relates back to, or like varying levels of success. I think it depends again, like what is the relationship with the news organization? Are they an oh, this is actually interesting. I was talking to a trainer and they were telling me that at an organization that they went in and did a discussion on security, somebody in the organization had tried to do that already and like no one cared. But as soon as this external person came in and was like brought in by management or whatever, everybody was like, oh yeah, you're right. So I don't know if it's like a legitimacy thing or what, but it definitely resulted in a different dynamic and different changes in our results. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the insightful presentation, Jen. I'm curious about, because you talked about various layers of news workers or journalists being produced here, like local news journalists, but also mainstream news journalists. And I believe you said like there were some differences in terms of their gender and also ethnicity. So like with all of this different demographics or their actual personal experiences, do they have different sense of the vulnerability to this insecurity issue? And also, depending on that, like, do they have different conceptualization, or do they have different demand for the needs of the insecurity issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so in general, if a journalist who I talked with was, female or not white, they were more likely to indicate that they'd experienced some sort of problem. Typically online harassment, most generally online harassment or physical abuse, like verbal assault, kind of a thing, when reporting on a particular issue. So it depended a little bit, so yes is the answer, but also depended a bit on the circumstances in which they were reporting, whether or not they faced a certain threat or not. And so what I noticed was there was this pivot to an analog sort of security dimension, which is we don't send our reporters out alone anymore to cover something. We send them in a group setting to give this sort of protection of having at least like another person there. I also noticed a difference between management and early career journalists, or at least journalists who were younger from an age demographic standpoint. And I think there's a couple things going on there. Management tends to be removed from sort of like the frontline journalism, right? They're not engaged in maybe responding to, audience queries or on different things or things like that. And so they don't feel it, they don't experience it. And so therefore there was more of that reactive approach that I mentioned. There's a removal of risk. Whereas if you have a younger journalist, maybe a social media supervisor, or not a supervisor, but a social media person, is very much in the line of fire and more visible, and that resulted in more concerns and threats and attacks against them. And so there was more of an indication that, hey, this is an important issue, we should care about it. However, there was also a dimension where the younger journalist doesn't want to necessarily bring it up to management because they don't want, I don't know, to be seen as a problem. And so then you have that disconnect where even if you're in a situation where you have a good manager, they might not know about the problems you're facing because you don't feel comfortable bringing them up. And I'll also say that just recently I was interviewing a general manager for a radio station, and he agreed to the interview. And I asked him kind of like, well, thank you so much for agreeing. This is one of the safety security interviews. And he said, no problem. My wife's a journalist, and she's experienced a lot of online harassment, so I wanted to take the time to talk to you. I was like, aha, that's why. So it really does depend, right, on sort of the closeness of the issue, and that depends a bit on their level in the organization, their role, but also like how they identify.
We could talk about just as a follow-up,
Yeah.
we talked about the reluctance to share their experiences
Yeah.
or like share their concerns with the higher level or management level. Do you feel like the variations among these people actually become another type of like obstacle for the organization as a whole to develop a tool or a training session for the team, or do you feel like the variations can actually be the factor that can contribute to the better the atmosphere of the organization?
Are you talking about if the journalist brings it up, then there might be a security culture that develops?
I feel like the variations, like
Yeah.
some people may have the greater sense of the vulnerability,
Yeah.
they need more events there, but like if they do not have they do not feel like they are supported by the general community, like they are not sharing this experience with the other people, they might become more silent, or
Yes.
they are not really like having a strong opinion. So like these kind of differences within the group can be an obstacle sometimes, I guess.
Yes.
To come up with a general solution or the solution for the whole, for the organization as a whole. So like, yeah, did you feel like that variations at this time point actually become a factor that makes things harder?
I think it does play a role, for sure, because if management is not aware of different incidents that younger journalists might be facing, they have no reason to do anything about it. I also don't want to blame the younger folks who might not feel comfortable sharing. I think that's a problem of a lot of things, but like maybe it's a culture of not having a culture of trust or vulnerability, right? So yes, I think that the variation is definitely determined. So maybe if you're in a smaller news organization and you have a good relationship with your manager and you bring it up, maybe depending on that person's resources and outlook, etc., maybe they would do something about that situation for that journalist. And so actually going back to the person I just mentioned, the general manager, he only has, he's a very small outlet, but I asked him like, well, how do you handle security and safety? And he was one of the ones that said, well, we never let somebody report alone. We always have another person go with them. We're also concerned about like online harassment because we have these back here. And so he takes steps to modify whatever the individual is experiencing, whatever they need. So I tried to get him to tell me like, but what do you do sort of like writ large? He said, well, it really depends on the person. Some people can just sort of like shake it off and it doesn't matter. Other people need a day off or something else, right? So he's very individualized, but he also has a very small news organization, so he might be able to provide that too. And he has a wife who is experienced online harassment, so he's like invested, right, in trying to mitigate it. Other questions?
Thank you very much for it. Appreciate it.
Thank you.